Okay, just a quick and simple video today about a quick and simple game. Atomic Runner on the Mega Drive is a game that I owned and really enjoyed back in the 90s, but it's also one that I've come back to throughout the years. Not frequently, but every now and then I've just felt like loading it up and seeing how far I could get through it. This is not Atomic Runner, at least it's not the Mega Drive version. This is actually the 1988 arcade version known as Atomic Runner Chelnov. I'd never played it or even heard of it until I came to make this video, but the ways in which it's similar to the Mega Drive port are instantly apparent, as are the ways in which the console version, coming 4 years later in 1992, significantly improved on the audio and visual aspects. It also changed the name for somewhat unusual reasons. Apparently Chelnov sounds a little bit too much like Chernobyl, especially in Japanese, and as the arcade game came out only a couple of years after the tragic and rather terrifying events of Chernobyl, it caused a few ruffled feathers. And there's also the fact that the main character of the arcade game is explicitly stated to be a Russian coal miner who survived a meltdown at a nuclear power plant and gained superpowers as a result, exactly the way the citizens of Chernobyl didn't. The developers claim this was all a coincidence, but they obviously didn't want to risk anything when it came to the Mega Drive version. Not only did they change the name, for the English language version at least, they also altered the entire story, such as it is. The main character is still called Chelnov, but now is a scientist whose father is killed and sister is kidnapped by aliens called Deatharians. How creative. These aliens claim to actually not be aliens at all, but in fact the original inhabitants of Earth, which is a moderately interesting story element, but since the narrative consists entirely of a couple of paragraphs of text at the beginning and end of the game, it's not exactly something that's going to be expanded upon. Anyway, Chelnov dons his father's secret power suit and becomes the Atomic Runner. Hey, that's the name of the game. Unfortunately, he's terrible at being a hero and he immediately gets captured by the aliens, who torture him for as long as it takes for Chelnov to get properly cheesed off and escape his confinement. And so the game begins. It's a side-scrolling shooter, but with a bit of a difference. It's got the forced scrolling of something like R-Type, but it's also basically a platformer. You're not a spaceship zipping around the screen at will, you're just a guy in a suit, albeit an atomic-powered one. You can't actually move backwards, the best you can do is stand still. You can turn around, but it takes an extra button press and you'll run backwards until you manually turn back. It takes a bit of getting used to, but it's fine once you get the hang of it, and the game is designed to accommodate the slightly odd gameplay well enough. For the most part. I've heard this game described as an endless runner, but I'm not sure how accurate that is. For one thing, you can stop running, at least for as long as it takes the screen to catch up with you. For another, it's definitely not endless. The game is broken into 7 levels and each of them is quite short, not much more than 5 or 6 minutes, assuming you make it straight through without dying, which would be a foolish assumption indeed once you get to the later levels. The first level though is not tough. It sees Chelnov escaping from the alien facility and into what seems to be a South American landscape, and the learning curve is pretty gentle. The game is also rather generous with handing out weapons, as it presents almost the entire game's arsenal to you through the course of this first level. Most of them simply shoot a projectile straight ahead, the laser, the fireball, the boomerang, and they're functionally almost identical. The only one that's significantly different is the 3 spiked balls, which sacrifice range for power and spread. Range is pretty useful in this game though, so I usually opt for something else, but they do have their uses. The first boss is a dragon's head or something embedded in the wall. It breathes fire and lunges at you occasionally, but it's really just a nice easy kill to get you on your way. Level 2 has a rather cool and rather macabre background with twisted humanoid figures and pulsating alien sacks filled with, well, whatever aliens keep in their sacks, I guess. I'm betting on sunscreen and a nice thermos filled with tea. That's what I'd have anyway. The music is pretty funky. In fact, most of the music in this game is good. It's perhaps not as memorable and distinctive as the true classics of the era. It doesn't really stand out, but if you stop and listen to it, you'll hear some nicely sophisticated melodies. And for whatever reason, it's really stuck with me over the years. I particularly like this bit. Like most side-scrolling shooters, there are pickups that will increase your weapon's power. Slightly less typical are the pickups that increase your jumping power. And naturally you lose the benefit of those pickups on death, but that's not as big a deal as it is in a lot of other games of the era. The pickups are plentiful, so no matter where you die, it's going to be a matter of seconds before you're back up to full power. In the case of the jump power-up, that's particularly important because jumping really is the only one important bit of mobility you have. Yes, you can move forward, but you can't do it quickly, and when enemy projectiles start flying thick and fast, it's often a well-timed jump that will save you. But this is where possibly the biggest limitation of the game and its biggest problem comes to the fore. Your jump is quite slow, and while jumping may be your only real option for mobility, you're still not exactly leaping about with the agility of a cat who's trained as an Olympic gymnast, like in that film, The Cat Who Trained to be an Olympic Gymnast, which definitely probably exists. Quite often when you jump out of the way of one projectile, you'll find yourself rising up to meet another head-on, and in that situation it's your head that's going to come off second best. You really don't have the maneuverability to avoid an unexpected projectile, so you really need to expect them, which means playing the game a hell of a lot until you've got everything memorized. Fortunately, you can at least land safely on enemies' heads, which also does a bit of damage. The second boss is a little tougher than the first, though not much. Destroy both eyes, which doesn't take long even with the non-fully powered up weapon, and it zooms off into the stratosphere. Well, its head does, while its bosomy body flails helplessly on the ground. Level 3, and the music is strangely absent? This is a bug that can be encountered from time to time, but thanks to the gods of emulation, a quick reset is all that's required to get it sorted. There we go. This level sees the introduction of the only new weapon you're going to see throughout this playthrough. It's a homing missile, not particularly powerful, but in a game like this, where positioning and aiming can be a challenge, its homing abilities are nothing to be sneezed at, or coughed, wheezed, or farted at. Seriously, don't fart at homing missiles. The expelled heat will only make it easier for them to track you. There's an extended platforming section in this level, but it's not too tricky as the enemies tend to hang back and let you do your thing. It's when the enemies get involved in the platforming that things get tough, as will be seen later. The boss also is not super tricky, although it fires out enough projectiles that it's easy enough to be caught out. But it dies pretty fast, so that's nice. Level 4 sees you running through Egypt for some reason. I have to admit, I like the way the aliens have started to mechanize the Sphinx, and I love this little pyramid zooming across the desert. I mean sure, if you're an almighty alien force, why not stick an engine on a millennia-old monument? Gameplay-wise, there's not a lot new in this level, and that basically holds true for the rest of the game. You've already seen most of what the game has to offer at this point. From now on, it's just a matter of things getting more frenetic and more difficult, and also, arguably, more unfair. Even the boss here is a repeat of the one from the second level, albeit with an extra form once you destroy both eyes. But in this case, I happen to have the short-range tri-ball weapon, and it's super effective. Just shotgun the eyes and they're destroyed in seconds. Ditto the head of the second form. In fact, it's dead almost before I can figure out what's happening. Level 5, and okay, there is one slightly novel gameplay element here. These drill-type things that block your path and fall on your head when you destroy them. They can be a huge pain, as you have to decide whether you're going to wait for them to fall or dash underneath them. If you happen to have the heat-seeking missiles at this point, you could be in trouble, as they tend to track towards the top sections, which can't be damaged. This really is a problem, as some of them need to be destroyed ASAP, or you're going to run out of space. The boss is not super threatening. Its attacks are easy enough to avoid once you know what you're doing, but it's also kind of tough to damage itself, as you need to hit the small orb in its chest. What is it with video game enemies and orbs embedded in their chests? They inevitably end up being their weak points which any passing protagonist will instantly recognise. I have no doubt it's fashionable, but is it worth dying over? Okay, on to the penultimate level, which is Snowy Moscow, I guess. Fortunately, the snow doesn't last long, which I appreciate because it's genuinely making my eyes go funny and giving me a headache. This level basically throws everything at you, tricky platforming, oodles of enemies, and those annoying drill things. Fortunately, I had the tri-balls this time, which makes short work of them and gives you plenty of time to figure out whether you should go under or over. The boss is possibly the toughest in the game until you figure out the strategy. That big cannon in combination with the smaller projectiles is really tough to avoid, but it is possible to get underneath it and just make small movements to avoid the small stuff. You can't actually damage the bastard in this form, you've just got to wait it out until its glowing chest orb, again with the chest orb, comes out and starts flying around by itself. With that done, it's time to head to New York for no reason other than the designers wanted the game's climax to take place on the Statue of Liberty. The only really notable thing about this level is the challenging and actually rather fun section where you need to bounce along on an enemy's head to avoid falling into the water. It's pretty cool. The boss is some random guy who almost immediately catches on fire. Oh, and then there's the giant alien queen. She's actually incredibly easy once you realise you need to jump on her arm when she charges you. But that's not the end, of course. She flies up to the top of the Statue of Liberty because every good villain knows they need a good backdrop for their ultimate demise. This fight is a bit more difficult, but it's really just a matter of knowing when to back up, when to bounce on her head, and when not to fall off the statue like a moron. Incidentally, the answer to that last one is never. Hooray! We get a tiny bit of victorious exposition and the credits roll, with no music, which may or may not be a bug. But then once the development team gets their moment in the spotlight, each and every enemy in the game also gets a shout out. Who knew they all had their own names? Who cared? And then, a shocking twist. Chelnov is randomly blown up by a previously defeated boss. He falls into the ocean and eventually washes up on a beach where he is miraculously found by Chelmy, his sister. I'm 99% sure this bit was only put in because they got to the end of making the game and remembered they'd said something about the main character's sister being kidnapped right at the start and needed to wrap up that thread. You know what? I could have survived without that particular bit of closure. So that's Atomic Runner. It wasn't a groundbreaking game, it wasn't anything really special, but I've enjoyed playing it again. The difficulty curve is gentle but satisfying, and the fundamental gameplay is just nice to experience. It's not the Mega Drive's best, but it was a good way to spend an hour or two when I was a kid, and that's still true today. Well, thanks for watching. Don't forget to... I forgot what I'm supposed to say here. Something about looking, cementing, and surviving. So yeah, do those things please. And get off my lawn.